Here's one of my biggest frustrations living in the United States of America. In this day and age where violence is so glorified, and I want to make sure that I elicit each of you to cooperate with me in our efforts to change the culture in this regard. Here it is. Okay, who are these people?
Timothy,
Virginia Tech, yes. Less people know his name because it's Cho Sun-Hui, but everybody knows Oklahoma City bombing, Virginia Tech massacre. Okay, and why do we know these people?
media.
The media. And I mean, you know, the April 12th thing is coming up. MSNBC is going to do a whole hour on Tim McVeigh like Monday night. I just want to call them up and say, what are the people doing? On NBC, the day of the Virginia Tech massacre, the tapes that Cho had made, they played them while the people were still being pulled from the rubble, okay? The families were still worrying about if their daughters were going to live or die, and NBC puts this on television. They hadn't even notified all the families. And by the way, there was an NBC boycott by those families all over. But you all know who they are. We all know who they are. Who are these people?
Victims.
Well, you guys know that because of the workshop you're in. But do you know their names? Do you know their stories? These are the Virginia Tech victims, my friends.
They are the what?
The Virginia Tech victims. The largest single shooting incident in U.S. history. This is, for example, Rima Samahan, who she was in musical theater. I've seen videotapes of her, I've met her whole family. She was stunningly beautiful. She could dance and sing like, I mean, she was going to be extraordinary. She was probably going to go on to Broadway. This young man, Ryan Clark, who was the resident assistant in the dorm, and at 7:30 in the morning, still in his underwear in his dorm room, heard a shooting at the end of the hallway, and with no thought to his own safety, ran down the hallway to see what had happened, to try to save the kids in his floor that he was in charge of, and he was killed. Or this man, whose story I cannot even tell. This is Professor Liviu Librescu, who was a Holocaust survivor and who came to the United States and taught engineering. And on the day of the massacre, because the shooter picked the one building on campus that didn't have lockable doors, he picked that oldest building for that reason, Professor Librescu put his body like this up against the wall while he shouted to his students, "Get out, get out." And he forced them to run out the window, and he stood there and took bullets in his back as the killer tried to get through the door, and he laid down his life for his students. Why is it that we know this man, but we don't know these people? We have to change that in our culture. Okay, now, very quick. I'm taking way too long, so I'm going to move quickly through this. When we do the work, I hope I've persuaded you of the value and the importance of working with victims. One of the things I want to be careful not to let happen is, just to tell you briefly what I think went wrong in Illinois. We had, of course, a lot of attention on the death penalty in Illinois. We had a governor that ended up clearing up death row because of it. And we should have, by now, have had abolition, but we don't. And the reason is because there was a very strong offender advocacy. We have, a lot of crime in Chicago, 50,000 people in Illinois prisons, a lot of violence. We have a huge offender advocacy community. And almost immediately after we got the moratorium and Governor Ryan clearing off death row, those offender advocates began to focus on life without parole instead. And they've been pushing for the last 5 years to end life without parole in Illinois, instead of working for abolition with a pure focus. And that has been divisive for me. I've had to break with some of my colleagues over this issue. I really want to just raise it as a question and as a warning to you. When you commit to working victim-centered abolition, you are taking on a certain obligation to be true and pure to that support. And I think that there is an obligation we have about victims' rights. I watched abolitionists who had used me and my sister happily for many years to tell our stories to advance their agenda, who immediately, as soon as they started going after life without parole, which I personally support, which my sister's killer is serving that sentence, they were very, very willing to be absolutely drop us like a hot potato. It's extremely traumatizing. They lost all their victims, not just us. But I would just ask you to think about the LWOP issue, the victims' rights issue, and remember that the title to this presentation today is that victims are stakeholders. They are key stakeholders. We're in the middle of a public policy debate. Senator, you know all about public policy debates. There's a lot of issues we have public policy debates about. The death penalty is a public policy debate. But in all public policy debates, stakeholders belong at the table in the conversation. And if victims of violent crime are not stakeholders in this conversation, folks, I don't know who is. We are key stakeholders in this conversation, and we belong fully at the table. Couple of quick caveats when you talk to victims. It's really, really important for abolitionists to remember not to be really focused on the offender when you talk to victims. That can be very hurtful. They really do not, it doesn't help the, let me give the example of the Benetton ads. That was an abolition approach where they put the death row inmates, they put their artwork up, their poetry up, they put them up in fashion clothing, they try to advance their humanity. We don't want to execute these guys, they're real human beings. I get that as an abolition strategy. You can't really do that to victims. It's glorifying the killers again. So I would just be careful about that strategy. Be careful when you talk with offender advocates who want to talk about the offenders as victims. I was beaten as a child, and that's why I killed these people. You know, I'm sad for that, and I know that that happens in the world. But it's really important that we distinguish between victims and offenders, because they are different. And remember that you never know with people where they might be in their grieving journey. Very quickly, victims' rights as a movement, historically, I'm going to do a little bit of history. I'm a history teacher by profession. I love doing history. Very important to know that the whole idea that victims have rights began really in the same civil rights movement time in the 60s, with the idea that they are an oppressed class, that they are a somewhat marginalized and a troubled group of people in some cases. And it was originally a progressive movement alongside women's rights and civil rights and so on. And those were when the organizations were born, the National Center for Victims of Crime, the National Organization of Victim Assistance. OVC is a federal office of victims of crime out of the Justice Department. We have now a whole huge field that's begun as a result of that. Now, the victim advocacy movement is mostly tied to professional prosecutors' offices, and has had a tendency to become more politically, more to the law and order side of the political spectrum because of that. But the good thing is that over the last several decades, we have ensconced it clearly as a right. Now, in all 50 states, there is either good, strong statute protecting victims' rights, or there's a constitutional amendment. You guys should know that Montana is one of only 17 states that doesn't actually have it in the Constitution. So we have some work to do, but we actually have some good statute here, which is good. And there is, of course, federal law and all sorts of other agencies. I'm actually one of the people that is most responsible for the human rights movement, articulating victims' rights as a human right. I actually urged and worked with the Human Rights Watch organization to do a study and publication that they credit me with, which connected to the idea of victims' rights and human rights. So that's one of my prouder accomplishments in my work. These are some of the classic victims' rights that you will see protected in law around the United States. The right to be informed, actually, you know, we already talked about how vital that is